The pharmacist grabbed my wrist before I could pull away. "Sir," she said, and her voice dropped low enough that the woman behind me in line couldn't hear. "Where did you get this cream?" I looked down at my arm. The little blue tube. The one my son had sent me 3 weeks ago, priority mail, with a handwritten note that said, "Use this every night, Dad. It'll help with the joint pain." I read about it online. "My son gave it to me," I said. "Why?" She didn't answer right away. She turned the tube over in her hands, reading the back label the way a doctor reads a chart when the numbers don't make sense. Then she looked up at me and said the words I still hear sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. "I need you to stop using this immediately, and I need you to let me call someone." I should back up. My name is Al. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years working quality control at a manufacturing plant outside of Cincinnati. Not glamorous work, but steady, and I was good at it. I retired 4 years ago with a pension, a modest 401k that I've been careful with, and a house I'd owned outright since 2019 after I made the last mortgage payment. My wife, Donna, passed from ovarian cancer 8 years ago. That was the hardest thing I've ever survived. And I say survived deliberately because there were months after her funeral where survival was genuinely in question. But I came through it, slowly, with the help of my daughter Ruth Ann, who drove 3 hours from Columbus every other weekend for almost a year just to make sure I was eating, and eventually with the help of time, which everyone says is the great healer, and which, in my experience, is more like a slow numbing than any kind of healing, but you take what you can get. My son Gareth, no, I'm sorry, I should say my other son. I have two. My younger son, Ruth Ann's brother, is named Philip. He's 41 now. He lives about 20 minutes from me, which always seemed like a good thing. Close enough for Sunday dinners. Close enough that when my truck needed a new alternator last winter, he came over with his tools without me even having to ask twice. Philip was always the one who called himself the practical one. Where Ruth Ann was warm and instinctive, Philip was methodical. He made spreadsheets for his grocery lists. He researched every major purchase for weeks before committing. When Donna was sick, he found her the clinical trial, spent 2 nights reading journal articles online, printed everything out in a binder with tabs. It didn't save her, but the trying mattered. I never forgot the trying. So when Philip started getting more attentive after my retirement, calling more, dropping by more, offering to help with things I hadn't asked for help with, I thought it was just him growing up, maturing. I thought he finally understood that I wasn't going to be around forever, and he was making the most of the time we had. I didn't question it. Why would I? The joint pain started about 14 months ago. At first I thought it was just the cold. Cincinnati winters are damp in a way that gets into your knees and hands, and I'd had minor arthritis for years. Nothing serious, but this was different. A deep ache that moved around, settled into my hips some days, my wrists on others. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning with my fingers throbbing. I went to my doctor. He ran the usual blood work, checked my inflammation markers, told me my results looked mostly fine, and suggested I try an anti-inflammatory regimen and see if things improved. I asked if there was something specific causing it. He said it could be a lot of things: stress, age, changes in my sleep patterns. I started keeping a journal of the pain, how bad it was on a scale of 1 to 10, which joints, what time of day. I'd always been systematic. 31 years in quality control will do that to you, and I thought if I tracked it long enough, I'd see a pattern. I saw a pattern, all right, just not the one I was expecting. 3 weeks after Philip sent me the cream, this was in October, 13 months into the pain, I noticed that the mornings were consistently worse. Much worse. If I'd skipped applying the cream the night before because I'd fallen asleep early, the next day wasn't as bad. I thought I was imagining it. I applied the cream on a Tuesday night, deliberately, and woke up Wednesday morning unable to make a fist. I still didn't connect the dots. Not fully. I told myself it was coincidence. I kept using the cream because Philip had sent it, and because it smelled vaguely medicinal in a way that felt legitimate, and because I trusted my son. That's the part I keep coming back to. That's the part that still makes me sit down when I'm standing. I trusted my son. Ruth Ann was the one who noticed. She came up in November for Thanksgiving. I told her on the phone that I wasn't feeling well, that the joint thing was getting worse, that some mornings I could barely button my shirt. She'd been pushing me to see a specialist, and I'd been resisting because I hate specialists. Not the doctors themselves, but the whole process. The referrals in the waiting rooms and the tests that lead to more tests. She was in the bathroom on her second morning here, looking for ibuprofen in the medicine cabinet, and she came downstairs holding the blue tube. "What is this?" she said. "Something Philip sent me, for the joint pain." She turned it over. "Dad, this doesn't have a manufacturer on it. Look." She held it out to me. "There's no company name, no address. It just says therapeutic compound. That's not how real products are labeled." I looked. She was right. I never looked that closely. "Where do you say he got it?" she asked. "He said he read about it online, some article about new anti-inflammatory compounds." She was quiet for a moment, and I knew that look on her face. That's the look Donna used to call her dog on a scent look. Something had locked into place in her mind, and she wasn't going to let it go. "I want to take this to a pharmacy," she said. "Have someone look at it." I almost said no. I felt the strange protective instinct, like she was accusing Philip of something without saying it, and I wanted to defend him. He's my son. He was trying to help. But I said yes, because Ruth Ann asked me, and I've never in my life been able to refuse Ruth Ann when she uses that particular tone of voice, measured, concerned, not demanding, but certain. We drove to the CVS on Montgomery Road. The pharmacist's name was on her badge. I'll call her the pharmacist, because that's what matters, not her name. She'd been there for years. I recognized her face from 100 prescription pickups. She spent about 4 minutes with the tube. She squeezed a tiny amount onto a piece of paper, looked at it under the light, smelled it. She went in the back for a moment. When she came out, she had a different expression than when she'd gone in. That's when she grabbed my wrist. That's when she said, "I need you to stop using this immediately." She told us, calmly, carefully, the way pharmacists are trained to deliver alarming information, that the compound contained trace elements consistent with heavy metal salts. She couldn't tell us exactly what without a proper lab analysis, but she said the presentation, the color, the consistency, the smell, was concerning enough that she would not let us leave without making sure we understood. This needed to go to a lab, and I needed to see a doctor today, not next week. Ruth Ann wasn't crying. She held herself very still the way she does when she's trying not to fall apart. She took the tube, put it in a plastic bag from her purse. She always has plastic bags. She's that kind of prepared, and she put her hand on my arm. "We're going to the urgent care," she said, "and then we're going to figure out what's going on." In the car, I didn't say anything for a long time. Ruth Ann drove. She knows me well enough to give me silence when I need it. What was going on in my head was something I didn't want to look at directly. The way you don't look directly at the sun. You know it's there. You know what it is. But looking straight at it would burn. I kept thinking about the spreadsheets Philip made, the binder with tabs he put together when Donna was sick, the way he called himself the practical one. I thought about how he'd started asking, over the past year or so, about my finances. Casually, just checking in. "How's the pension holding up, Dad? You still happy with that financial advisor? You ever think about updating your will now that you're retired?" I thought he was being responsible, planning ahead. I thought it was that same practical nature, turned toward protecting the family. I sat in the passenger seat of my daughter's car on a gray November morning, and I thought, what if he wasn't planning ahead for me? The urgent care doctor ordered blood work. He was young, maybe early 30s, and when I explained what the pharmacist had said, he took it seriously in that quiet way that young doctors have when they're trying not to alarm you while also absolutely being alarmed. He said he was going to run a heavy metals panel. He said it might take a few days for full results, but he'd rush what he could. Ruth Ann sat with me the whole time. She'd called her husband from the waiting room and told him she was staying an extra few days. He hadn't even hesitated. I heard her side of the conversation, and he just said, "Of course. Do what you need to do." The preliminary results came back 2 days later. Elevated arsenic levels, not catastrophically high. Not immediately life-threatening, but elevated in a way that was, The doctor said carefully, inconsistent with environmental exposure and consistent with a repeated low-level ingestion or absorption through skin. Skin absorption, a cream you rub in every night. I sat with that for a long time. I want to tell you what I did next, because I think this is where the story matters. Not just for me, but for anyone who might be in a situation that looks anything like mine. I did not call Philip. I know that sounds obvious, but there was a part of me, a father part, the oldest and most stubborn part, that wanted to call him, wanted to give him the chance to explain, wanted to hear him say there'd been some mistake, that he'd gotten the product from somewhere reputable, that he hadn't known, that he would never. Ruth Ann talked me out of it. "Dad," she said, "if you call him, he'll know you know. And if he knows you know, you lose every advantage. You lose every piece of evidence. He'll have time to prepare." She paused. "Let the police do this." She was right. She's almost always right, which is something I've learned to admit only in the last decade or so. We called the police. A detective from the county sheriff's office came to the house the next morning. We gave him the tube. We gave him the blood work results. We told him about the pattern, the pain getting worse, the mornings after applying the cream, the improvement on nights I'd skipped it. He was a methodical man, probably a few years younger than me, and he took notes the old-fashioned way, in a small notebook. He didn't seem skeptical. He didn't seem surprised either, which I found both reassuring and deeply disturbing. He asked about my finances. I told him about the house, the pension, the 401k, which, I learned later, Philip had been quietly trying to get me to change the beneficiary on for about 8 months, framing it as updating your paperwork and making sure everything's in order. I'd been meaning to sit down and go through it. I'd been meaning to. The detective nodded and wrote something down. He asked about my will. I told him it was current, split equally between Philip and Ruth Ann. He asked if I'd made any changes recently or if anyone had suggested I make changes. I said yes. I said Philip had mentioned a few times that it might be simpler if the house went to him directly, since he was local and could handle the estate more easily. He'd framed it as logistics, just practical. Always practical. That took 3 weeks. I didn't see Philip during that time. I called him twice, kept the conversations normal, talked about football and my truck, and whether I'd had the gutters cleaned before winter. He sounded normal. He laughed at the right moments. He said he'd come by for Christmas, see if we could get Ruth Ann and the kids up too, make a real holiday of it. I hung up after the second call and sat at my kitchen table for about 20 minutes without moving. This was my son. I taught him to ride a bike in the driveway of the house on Sycamore Street. I sat in the hospital waiting room for 11 hours the night his mother was diagnosed and held his hand when the doctor came out, because he was 23 and he needed his father, and I was there. I don't know when he became someone else. I don't know if there was a specific moment or if it was something that accumulated slowly. The way rust does. You don't see it happening, and then one day you look at the fence and it's gone. The detective called me on a Tuesday morning in early December. They'd completed their analysis. They had enough for an arrest. A man from Philip's office had come forward. Apparently, Philip had made some comments over the past year, casual comments about what he'd do when he inherited, comments that had seemed like dark humor at the time, but looked different now. There were also searches on his home computer, the kind of searches that once a detective tells you about them, you can't unknow. They picked him up that Tuesday afternoon at his office. I was not there. Ruth Ann offered to drive me, to let me witness it somehow. I said no. I didn't want to see it. I don't know what I would have felt watching that, and I didn't want to find out. I've been asked since then, by the detective, by my doctor, by a therapist I've been seeing at Ruth Ann's insistence, whether I'm angry. The honest answer is that I don't experience it as anger exactly. Anger is hot and it moves. What I feel is more like a door that's been closed. A room I used to have access to, that's now locked from the inside. I can stand in the hallway and know the room is there, know what's inside it. Every Thanksgiving, every bike lesson, every hospital waiting room, but I can't get in anymore. Maybe that's the grief doing what grief does. Maybe the anger's in there too, and I just haven't gotten to it yet. My therapist says I don't have to rush it. The lab results confirmed arsenic. The cream had been made, and this is what keeps me up at night. What I come back to when I'm trying to understand the mechanics of it. The cream had been made to order. Philip had found someone, somewhere, who would put arsenic compounds into a skin cream and package it to look like a legitimate product. He'd done the research. He'd put in the effort. The same effort he put into that binder for his mother. The same systematic, careful, thorough effort. I've thought about that a lot. The charges included attempted murder, which the prosecutor said she was confident about given the evidence. The arsenic levels in my blood work, the lab results on the cream, the computer searches, the witness from his office. She said it was one of the more thoroughly documented cases she'd seen, which was a strange thing to hear about something that had happened to me. Philip hired a lawyer and entered a not guilty plea. That's his right, and I don't have anything to say about it. The process is the process. What I will say is this. The week after the arrest, Ruth Ann came back up to Cincinnati. She brought her kids, my grandchildren, 9 and 12, who didn't know what was happening, just knew that something had happened and that Grandpa needed company. We raked the last of the leaves in the backyard and ordered pizza and watched a movie I can't remember the name of. The kids fell asleep on the couch. Ruth Ann and I sat at the kitchen table with decaf coffee and didn't talk for a while. Then she said, "I'm sorry I didn't notice sooner." I looked at her. "What?" "The cream, the pattern, the questions he was asking you about the money. I should have noticed sooner." I shook my head. "He's your brother. You trusted him. That's not something to apologize for." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Still." I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. She's so much like her mother sometimes that it catches me off guard. The same way of holding herself. The same dog on a scent. Focus. "You saved my life," I said. "You found it. You took me to that pharmacy. That's what happened." She didn't say anything. She just turned her hand over under mine and held on. I'm telling this story because I think there are things in it that matter beyond what happened to me specifically. I spent 14 months getting sicker and attributing it to age, to weather, to stress. I went to my doctor and told him about my symptoms, but I didn't tell him about the cream because I hadn't connected the dots, because it never occurred to me that the connection was there to make. If you are getting sick and you can't figure out why, tell your doctor about everything. Every supplement, every cream, every product someone gave you. Everything. I also want to say this. The love I had for my son was real. Nothing about what he did retroactively makes that love a mistake or a delusion. I loved him the way a father loves a child, completely and without a full understanding of who he actually was, which is maybe the definition of that kind of love. Learning who he actually was doesn't erase the love. It just changes what I do with it. What I do with it now is set it down, put it in that locked room with everything else. And I walk away from the door. My arsenic levels are back to normal. My joints don't hurt anymore. The house is still mine. The pension is still mine. I updated my will last month, sat down with my attorney for 2 hours and went through every detail. And Ruth Ann is the executor now, and that is right and good and how it should be. Last week, my granddaughter asked me if I wanted to teach her to ride a bike. She's 9 and her balance is better than she thinks. I said yes. Of course I said yes. We went out to the driveway, and I held the back of the seat, and I told her to look where she was going and not at the ground, because wherever you point your eyes is where you'll go. And she wobbled and laughed and wobbled again. And eventually, she went. The thing I keep returning to, not every day anymore, but often enough, is how much of this I chose not to see. Not because I was stupid. I spent 31 years catching errors that other people missed. I built a career out of noticing when something was off, but when it came to Philip, I had a blind spot the size of everything I'd ever hoped he would be, and that blind spot nearly killed me. There's a version of me that stays angry about that feels like a fool for trusting his own son with something as basic as his health. But I've spent enough time sitting with this now to understand that trust isn't a failure of intelligence. It's an act of character. I trusted Philip because that's what a father does, and that trust said something true about who I am, even if it said something terrible about who he turned out to be. The wrong was entirely his. The love was entirely real. What Ruth Ann had, and what saved my life, was something I've been trying to name properly ever since. It wasn't just love. Plenty of people love their parents and still look away from hard things because looking is uncomfortable. What she had was the courage to follow what she noticed, even when the conclusion was unbearable. She picked up that too. She asked the question. She drove me to that pharmacy on a gray November morning when the easier thing, the kinder feeling thing in the moment, would have been to put the tube back and say nothing. That kind of honesty, the kind that costs something, is rarer than people think. It's also the kind that matters. I think about what I would tell a man in my position before any of this happened, before the pharmacist's face, before the blood work. I would tell him, pay attention to the things you're explaining away. When your body is telling you something is wrong and you keep finding reasons to ignore it, that's not wisdom. That's avoidance wearing wisdom's clothes. And when someone you love gives you something for your health, it is not a betrayal of that love to ask questions about it. Trust and verification are not opposites. I know that now in a way I couldn't have learned any other way. What Philip did required planning. Patience, a systematic, careful mind turned entirely toward destruction. He used his best qualities in service of something indefensible, and that's the part that still sits in me like a stone. Not the hatred, because I don't think I have that in me for my own child, but the waste. The sheer senseless waste of a person who could have been something else entirely. I'm not the man I was before this. I don't think I could be, and I'm not sure I'd want to be. That man trusted too completely and watched too little. This man keeps his eyes open. This man had a 2-hour conversation with his attorney about his estate and didn't apologize for asking detailed questions. This man holds on to the people who showed up. Ruth Ann, her husband, my grandchildren with their bikes and their wobbling and their laughter, and doesn't spend what's left of his energy grieving the people who didn't. My granddaughter learned to ride that bike. She looked where she was going, like I told her, and she went. That's enough. Some days that's more than enough.